Okay, Mr. Jones here. I'm going to show how to use basic watercolors. So I have a really basic watercolor set that I'm going to use for my example here, just the simple. And these are fine, professional people use these. You can buy a fancy set that has a bunch of colors, or you can also get watercolor that comes in tubes and you just squeeze out a teeny bit of it. I have 2 cups of water here. One is for my cleaning. When I clean the brush, it's called dirty water, so this is going to get dirty faster. And then I have one that's my clean water that I use for actual painting. So we never did this in class because we didn't have enough space or cups to use, but generally you'll have a dirty, and you gotta make sure that you don't mix them up. Now with the brushes, generally cheap watercolor sets come with a brush like this. It gets better once you wet it. It comes down to a point once it's wet. It's soft. It's made from animal hair, and they're okay. If you get one that's soft like this, that's nice. That's a good brush that you can use. You don't want to use acrylic brushes. Acrylic brushes are really hard and like this. This will really ruin your watercolors. So you want to avoid anything that has like the flat tip like that to use with watercolors. Some people do, and whatever. I generally like to keep my brushes wet, so I will put them, and I have different size brushes, so I have some smaller ones, and I would keep them wet in there so that those are just always wet, and that also keeps them clean. Okay. Now when I want to use a color, what you do basically, if I'm using the green, is you put some water on it and you tickle it. You're not scooping out the paint, you just tickle it. Now the tray is actually for you to check to see how opaque your color is. Like how dark do you want your color? Do you want it that dark? If you don't, you can always add more water to it to thin it out. Okay, and then you can watercolor that. Now the water doesn't go where you want it to, and you'll have spots. It's uneven. It's actually supposed to look like that. Okay, but you can spread it around a little bit and move it. Now let's say that I think I put too much watercolor on there. One thing you can do to fix it is you have a paper towel and you get all the water off of your brush, and then you take your brush and it will soak up the thing. So instead of putting the water down, it's soaking it up, and I can kind of erase what I don't want on there. Okay. Now there are techniques where you can, if I have a very definite shape, let's say like this, and I only want the watercolor to be inside there. So what I can do is pre-wet this space and wet it like that. So I'm only putting the water on the inside there. Now I'm going to pick a color, so I'll pick, let's say blue. I put a little bit of water on it and I tickle it. I'm not scooping the paint out. You don't do that with watercolor. It's not paint. You're actually painting with the water. So before this dries, I just put my color on there. If you notice, it's only going to go where I put the water. It's not going to spill out into another area. So if I pick this up and move it around, it's only going to stay in the area that I put the water in. Okay? So that's one neat way of doing that. There's a lot of, they call it pre-wetting techniques, painting on wet. The only problem with it, it does make your colors fan out and all of that. The other thing is you don't want to put one color next to another color while it's still wet. So if I put some green over here while it's still wet, it's going to start bleeding into my color and messing it up. So the general rule is you color something with the watercolor, then you go work on something else, and then you come back. Now another thing you can do with watercolor is a process of building up the paints. So let's say I wanted this to be more of a blue-green. I come over and take my blue once it's dry, and I can put it on here and use that to kind of shade with it. Okay. So, and I can keep building this up and making it darker and darker with the watercolor. Okay. So you can mix watercolors. You can either mix it on the tray, and that's actually what this tray is for, is to mix your colors, and then when it gets too dirty you can get some water or just a towel and wipe it off. You could also get a separate plate. I usually have a paper towel handy. So again, let's say that I'm doing a sphere or something. Let's see, I'm going to do it with orange here. So let's say I'm painting an orange. I can paint the orange, get the basic shape down like that. I know it's very light, you can barely see it. Again, it's easier to add more than to subtract, so I can just keep building this up, adding more to it. You can see since it's already wet, the color's kind of spreading out where it's wet. Okay. Now if I want to try and keep one end white, I can push this watercolor around to be only in my dark areas. And then if I don't want that one area to be that dark, I can dry off my brush and sort of suck that spot up. Okay. But you can kind of push your watercolors around to get where you want. Now let's say I wanted to shade this a little bit more. Now I could do the technique where I use the complementary color blue, but for this I'm just going to use red to kind of get a little extra shading there. So I'm going to get a little bit of extra red, and I want to make sure it's not too dark. That's pretty good there. And I'm going to add that to where I want it to be shaded. Okay. Usually I'll wait till it's dry before I add the second color on top. It's just easier to move it around and manipulate it when the other color's dry, and then I can blend it out a little bit. See, it's kind of making my orange erase that I had put on there before. But really, watercoloring, and then if it gets too dry, you can always just take some straight of your clean water and sort of put it on there. So watercolor is basically kind of pushing around the color to get it to where you want it to be. Okay. But again, you don't scoop the color out. You're actually just getting the water. Your paint is actually the water, and you just